Prince William has just stunned the entire United Kingdom by finally shattering his composed silence, standing before the encrypted broadcast feed at Kensington Palace, with a fury the nation has never before witnessed from the future king, unleashing a devastating revelation about his younger brother Harry that has obliterated the last fragile thread of brotherhood between them. For nearly a decade, William had held his tongue, honoring the solemn deathbed vow made to his grandfather Prince Philip in the final hours before the Duke of Edinburgh drew his last breath at Windsor Castle in April 2021, an oath sworn upon a leather-bound naval logbook that Philip had carried since his days aboard HMS Valiant. But tonight, that sacred vow lies in ruins, shattered by an act so audacious, so calculated, so ruthlessly opportunistic that even William's iron aristocratic composure could not withstand it. What exactly did Prince Philip forbid on that final gray afternoon before the machines fell silent? Why did the late Duke explicitly order a certain title never to be inherited, revived, or wielded as leverage by any descendant of the House of Windsor? And what dark, hidden tragedy from the summer of 2019 finally compelled Prince William to break his grandfather's most solemn commandment and expose the devastating truth about Harry's forbidden maneuver before? 20 million viewers watching live across the globe? The library at Kensington Palace was cavernous and hauntingly quiet that Tuesday evening, the pale amber light of a dying October sun filtering through the mullioned windows and casting long crimson shadows across the mahogany floor. Outside, a biting autumn wind rattled the ancient chestnut trees along the Broad Walk, and the distant chime of Kensington church bells told 7 o'clock across the darkening London sky. Inside, dust motes danced in the last rays of daylight, drifting lazily above the great Persian rug that had once belonged to Queen Victoria, its intricate crimson and gold weave now silent witness to a moment that would fracture the House of Windsor beyond repair. On the enormous mahogany desk that had served William since he first took residence at apartment 1A, 3 objects lay arranged with almost ceremonial precision. The first was a cream-colored envelope bearing the unmistakable royal cipher of Prince Harry, its wax seal already broken, the crimson fragments scattered like drops of blood across the polished wood. The second was a leather-bound naval logbook, faded and cracked with age, its brass hinges tarnished, its cover embossed with the personal crest of Prince Philip and the single Greek word Philip had chosen as his private motto. And the third, resting between them like an accusation, was a single sheet of cream-colored parchment, upon which Harry had written the demand that had shattered his brother's restraint. William stood motionless at the tall bay window, his back to the room, his fingers gripping the sill with such force that his knuckles had turned white as bone. Behind him, his private secretary Sir Clive Alderton stood frozen near the doorway, clipboard clutched against his chest, sweat gathering visibly at his temples despite the cool October air. The great-grandfather clock in the corner ticked with agonizing slowness, each mechanical stroke landing like a hammer blow in the suffocating silence. William had read the final line of Harry's letter twice, then a third time, and it was on the third reading, when the full audacity of what his brother had done finally penetrated the walls of his aristocratic composure, that something inside the future king finally, catastrophically broke. He turned from the window with a slowness that was itself terrifying, his features drained of color, his blue eyes glacial, his voice, when it finally came, stripped of every ounce of the diplomatic warmth for which he had become known. "For 9 years," William said, his voice growly and trembling with a fury he no longer troubled himself to hide, "the world has spoken about my grandfather, about what he wanted, about what he stood for. Tonight I am speaking for him." Sir Clive flinched as though struck. Across the palace, in the encrypted communications room 3 floors below, technicians were frantically working to sever the satellite feed that William had personally ordered, opened only minutes earlier. But the future king had already anticipated this. He had personally overridden every fail-safe, every institutional protocol, every buried mechanism that the palace machinery had built over decades to prevent precisely this kind of unauthorized broadcast. The signal was going out, and there was nothing the men in gray could do to stop it. The message that had triggered this seismic rupture had arrived at Kensington Palace only minutes before the great oak doors were due to close for the evening at 6:30, delivered by a household courier who had driven at reckless speed from a discreet legal address in Mayfair. It had come sealed with the personal cipher of Prince Harry, marked for the immediate attention of the Prince of Wales, and it had contained not a plea, not an apology, not even a request. It had contained a formal demand. Harry was not merely asking to return to the royal fold. He was demanding renewed access to the royal household, to the private financial trusts, to the duchy communications, to the entire architecture of the institution he had publicly denounced only 2 years earlier. And in the final paragraph, in a maneuver so calculated it could only have been architected by the most ruthless legal minds in London, Harry had described himself using a title connected directly to Prince Philip. a designation the late Duke had personally ordered, never to be inherited, never to be revived, never to be used as leverage by any descendant, under any circumstance, for any purpose. The chestnut trees outside the window shuddered in a sudden gust of wind, and William closed his eyes for the briefest moment. And suddenly he was no longer in the library at Kensington Palace, but standing in the small private drawing room at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, on a cold January afternoon in 2020. The scent of pipe tobacco and beeswax polish hung in the air, and the rhythmic ticking of the Georgian bracket clock on the mantelpiece kept time with his own thundering heart. Prince Philip had been seated in his favorite wingback chair beside the crackling fire, a tartan blanket draped across his knees, his sharp blue eyes as piercing as they had been in the days when he commanded destroyers in the Mediterranean. William had been summoned personally, without protocol officers, without private secretaries, without witnesses of any kind. And Philip had spoken in that clipped, precise naval voice that brooked no interruption. "William, listen to me carefully. There is a title. You know the one. Should Harry ever attempt to use it as leverage, should he ever try to weaponize it against this family, against your grandmother, against your father, against you, you will crush it. You will not negotiate. You will not compromise. You will crush it. Do you understand me?" And William, then only 37 years old, had bowed his head and given his word. He opened his eyes and turned to face the camera. "My grandfather," he began, his voice steadier now but colder than any who knew him had ever heard, "understood the machinery of this institution better than any man alive. He served it for 73 years. He watched it consume good people, decent people, honorable people. And in his final months he made me swear, upon his own naval logbook, that certain lines would never be crossed, certain titles would never be resurrected, certain doors would remain forever closed." Sir Clive Alderton had begun to visibly shake. Somewhere in the corridors outside, the sound of hurried Oxford shoes striking marble echoed with increasing urgency. The palace machinery was mobilizing, but William was faster, and he had planned this with the surgical precision of a man who had spent his entire adult life learning how to outmaneuver the men in grey. For decades, they had operated in the shadows of Buckingham Palace, Clarence House, and Kensington itself, a network of senior courtiers whose faces never appeared in official photographs, whose names never featured in the annual honors lists, whose influence extended into every corridor of the British establishment. They wore charcoal suits and polished Oxford shoes and carried leather clipboards, and their cold eyes had watched every royal generation since the abdication crisis of 1936. They had been the invisible architects of Diana's isolation. They had been the ruthless mechanics behind the fracture that had split William and Harry apart in the terrible summer of 2019. And now, William understood with a clarity want his blood to ice. They were the true architects behind Harry's audacious demand. Harry had not written that letter alone. Harry had been advised, coached, maneuvered, weaponized by figures within the very institution he claimed to have escaped. The men in grey had never let him go. They had simply repurposed him. The specific title Harry had claimed was one that had been discussed only 3 times in the recorded history of the modern monarchy. Whispered between Philip and the Queen, referenced obliquely in a sealed 1997 memorandum drafted by Lord Fellows, and finally, in April 2021, forbidden absolutely by the dying Duke himself. It carried with it not merely ceremonial weight but hereditary financial rights, access to the Balmoral trust structures, and a specific line of succession privilege that Philip had believed, correctly, could be exploited by a sufficiently ambitious individual to destabilize the entire hereditary framework of the monarchy. Harry had claimed it in writing. Harry had submitted it through legal channels. Harry had, in the final line of his demand, cited a precedent that only 3 living people in the world could possibly have known existed, which meant William understood with a cold and terrible certainty that Harry had been briefed by someone still operating inside the palace today. The antique rotary phone on William's desk began to ring, its shrill brass bells shattering the suffocating silence of the library. William stared at it for a moment, before crossing to the desk and lifting the receiver. The voice on the other end was fractured, broken, stripped of every ounce of the sovereign authority it had once commanded. "William." It was King Charles. "William, please. Whatever you are about to do, please. He is still your brother." William closed his eyes. He could hear his father's labored breathing, the tremor in the aging monarch's voice, the sound of a man who had already lost too much and could not bear to lose more. "Father," William said quietly, "he used grandfather's forbidden title. He weaponized it against you, against the crown, against everything grandfather made me swear to protect." There was a long silence on the line. And then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, Charles said, "I know. God help us all, I know." And the line went dead. 20 million people were watching live. Across the pubs of Edinburgh, pint glasses had frozen mid-air. In taxi ranks from Belfast to Cardiff, drivers sat motionless with their radios turned to maximum volume. In the newsroom at the BBC's broadcasting house, senior editors stood in stunned silence around the monitors, aware they were witnessing the most consequential royal broadcast since the abdication of Edward VIII. And in a rented villa on the outskirts of Montecito, California, Prince Harry sat alone in a darkened study, his face illuminated only by the pale blue glow of a laptop screen, watching his elder brother systematically dismantle the maneuver that had taken his legal team 18 months to construct. William reached across the mahogany desk and picked up the leather-bound naval logbook. He opened it slowly, reverently, to a page marked with a faded silk ribbon. Inside, in Prince Philip's own spidery handwriting, were 3 lines of black ink written on the 28th of March, 2021, only 9 days before his death. William did not read them aloud. He simply held the book up to the camera, allowing the world to see, for the first time in history, the private handwriting of the Duke of Edinburgh, addressing the exact scenario now unfolding. "This is what my grandfather wrote," William said, his voice cracking for the first time. 9 days before he died, he knew. He predicted this. He named the mechanism by which Harry would eventually be persuaded to attempt this. He named the courtier who would advise him. He named the legal firm that would draft the demand. He named all of it, with mathematical precision, 6 years before it happened. Sir Clive Alderton made a small choked sound and reached out to steady himself against the doorframe. The flashback came unbidden, triggered by the scent of the aged leather, and William was suddenly a boy of 15 again, standing in the drawing room at Highgrove on a summer afternoon in 1997, only weeks before the catastrophic events of that August in Paris. His mother had been kneeling in front of him, her hands on his shoulders, her blue eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. "William, my darling, listen to me. There are men in this palace who do not love us, who have never loved us, who will use anything, anyone, any weakness they can find, to bend this family to their will. Promise me that when you are king, you will not let them do to your brother what they are trying to do to me." And young William, understanding only fragments of what she meant, had nodded solemnly and given his word. The scent of white gardenias had drifted through the open French windows. The distant chime of the grandfather clock had marked 4 o'clock, and Diana had kissed his forehead and whispered, "The swallow always finds its way home, my darling, always. Even when the cage door is bolted shut." William blinked, and he was back in the library at Kensington Palace, the naval logbook heavy in his hands. He set it down carefully on the desk and turned once more to face the camera. "My mother," he said, "understood what my grandfather understood. That the true enemy of this family has never been the press, has never been the public, has never been the endless scrutiny under which we live. The true enemy has always been the machinery itself. The men who serve no crown but their own ambition. The men who wear no uniform but the charcoal suit. The men who have, for 9 years, been quietly grooming my brother to attempt precisely what he attempted today." A single tear slipped down his cheek, and he did not brush it away. He reached beneath the desk, and there was a soft mechanical click as a hidden compartment released. From within, William withdrew a small silver box, tarnished with age, engraved with the personal crest of Prince Philip and the single Greek word that had been the Duke's private motto. He set the box on the desk and opened it slowly. Inside, resting on a bed of faded blue velvet, was a small brass cipher key and a sealed forensic document bearing the authentication stamps of 3 separate agencies. "6 months ago," William continued, his voice steady now, "I commissioned an independent forensic investigation into the legal firm that drafted my brother's demand. The findings, authenticated by former officers of MI6 and cross-verified through biometric and cryptographic signatures, will be released in full to the Metropolitan Police tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. What they reveal is that the senior partner of that firm has been receiving communications, monthly, without interruption, from a courtier still operating inside Buckingham Palace today. A man whose name I will not speak aloud, but whom my grandfather named on the 28th of March, 2021, in the logbook you have just seen." The library seemed to hold its breath. Sir Clive Alderton had gone the color of old parchment. In the encrypted communications room 3 floors below, the technicians had abandoned their attempts to sever the feed, and were now simply watching, transfixed, as the future king systematically dismantled the invisible architecture that had governed the House of Windsor for nearly a century. The trap had been set, and it was the men in gray who were cornered. The encrypted satellite phone on the desk began to vibrate with an urgent, insistent buzz. William glanced at the screen, and for the first time that evening, something like grief passed across his features. He lifted the phone and pressed it to his ear. The voice on the other end was cracked, broken, unrecognizable as the polished Californian confidence Harry had cultivated over the past several years. It was the broken sob of a 15-year-old boy walking behind his mother's coffin in the September rain of 1997. "William, please. I didn't know what he was, what they were. They told me it was mine by right. They showed me documents. They said grandfather would have wanted this. Please, brother. I didn't know." William closed his eyes. His jaw tightened. And when he spoke, His voice was not the voice of the future king, but the voice of the older brother who had, 28 years earlier, held Harry's small hand as they walked behind their mother's coffin through the silent streets of London. "Harry, come home, not through them, through me, only through me. Do you understand?" There was a long, shuddering silence on the line. And then Harry, in a voice so small it was barely audible, whispered yes, and the line went dead. The library was utterly silent. 20 million people across the globe sat transfixed before their screens. In Montecito, in Los Angeles, in New York, in London, in Sydney, in every capital on every continent, the world had stopped to witness the moment the House of Windsor either fractured beyond repair or, against every expectation, began the impossible work of healing. William stood very still for a long moment, his hand still resting on the silver box, his eyes fixed on the naval logbook that had belonged to his grandfather. He was thinking of Philip's final words to him in that small drawing room at Wood Farm. He was thinking of his mother's promise about the swallow finding its way home. He was thinking of the small boy in the ill-fitting suit who had walked behind the coffin and squeezed his hand and whispered, "Are they going to hurt us too?" "Will?" He drew a long breath and turned once more to face the camera. "There is one more thing," he said, "one more piece of the machinery that must be exposed before this broadcast ends." In August of 2019, during the events at Frogmore Cottage that the public has never been told about, a senior courtier attempted to convince my brother that I had personally sanctioned the surveillance operation being conducted against him and his wife. He produced documents. He produced recordings. He produced what appeared to be my personal signature authorizing the operation. All of it was fabricated. All of it was designed to sever, permanently, the bond between two brothers whom this institution has always feared. Because two brothers united can outlast any machinery, any apparatus, any invisible architecture the men in gray can construct. William's voice dropped to almost a whisper. That courtier is the same man who advised my brother to write today's demand. That courtier is the same man my grandfather named on the 28th of March, 2021. That courtier is still, tonight at this very moment, sitting in his office at Buckingham Palace. He is watching this broadcast, and by tomorrow morning he will be answering to the Metropolitan Police. The chestnut trees outside the window shuddered again. Somewhere in the distant corridors of Kensington Palace, a door slammed. Sir Clive Alderton had begun to weep silently, and William, for the first time in nearly a decade, felt something like peace settle across his shoulders. He picked up his brother's letter from the mahogany desk. He picked up the small cream-colored envelope with its broken wax seal, and he held them up to the camera one last time. "This demand," he said, "is withdrawn, not by my brother, but by me, on his behalf. Because whatever else he is, whatever else has happened between us, he is still my mother's son. He is still my father's son. He is still the boy who held my hand in September of 1997. And no machinery, no apparatus, no invisible architecture will ever again be permitted to weaponize him against this family, or this family against him." He tore the letter once, twice, 3 times, and let the fragments fall like snow onto the Persian rug. Then he closed the naval logbook. He closed the silver box. He closed the leather portfolio containing the forensic documents, and he looked directly into the camera one last time. "My grandfather made me swear to crush it if this ever happened, and I have crushed it. Not the title, not my brother, but the machinery, the men in gray, the invisible architects. Their reign inside this palace ends tonight." He paused. "For my grandfather, for my mother. For the swallow that has, at long last, found its way home." He reached across the desk and pressed a small button. The encrypted feed cut to black. There was no music. There was no commentary. There was no BBC anchor rushing to interpret what had just been witnessed. Across 20 million screens, there was only silence. In the pubs of Edinburgh, pint glasses were lowered slowly to tables. In the taxi ranks of Belfast and Cardiff, drivers sat with their hands frozen on their steering wheels. In the newsroom at Broadcasting House, senior editors turned to one another and could find no words. In a darkened study in Montecito, a man who had once been called Prince Harry sat with his face in his hands and wept the tears he had not permitted himself to shed in nearly 9 years. At Buckingham Palace, the great oak doors closed for the evening at precisely 7:30. A palace spokesman, when approached by the press pool gathered outside the gates, offered only 2 words before turning away. No comment. Inside, in an office on the 2nd floor overlooking the mall, a man in a charcoal suit and polished Oxford shoes sat very still at his mahogany desk. His clipboard lay untouched before him. His cold eyes were fixed on a blank wall, and for the first time in 43 years of service to the crown, his hands were trembling. At Kensington Palace, William walked slowly from the library to the small private chapel adjoining his personal apartments. In his hands he carried the naval logbook and the silver box. He knelt before the small altar. He placed both objects at the foot of the cross, and he whispered so quietly that only he could hear, "It is done, grandfather. It is done, mother. He is coming home." Somewhere in the darkening London sky, a swallow impossibly out of season wheeled once above the palace rooftops and disappeared into the night. The truth had saved her boys. The swallow had finally flown free. The secret was out. And across a stunned, silent nation, the machinery that had governed the House of Windsor for nearly a century had, at long last, been broken.